Good evening. Thank you for being here tonight. We are going to start with the word of prayer. I've asked Ryan to lead us before we begin class.
Heavenly Father, we're thankful for tonight, for a time that we can pause in the middle of the week to open up your word. And tonight, as we finish the book of Ephesians, we're thankful for Tim and Roger and Doug as they've led us in our thoughts and discussions on this book. And tonight, as we close out this final chapter, help us to realize that you've equipped us with everything that we need to overcome all the different things that Satan and the power of this world can throw at us. You've equipped us with your truth, with faith, with righteousness, and all the other ways that we can defeat him. And Father, help us to realize that we have each other as well to overcome all those challenges. Help us to approach tonight with open hearts and open minds. In Jesus' name we pray.
Thank you. All right, so tonight we're going to basically finish out the book of Ephesians. And as I mentioned on this Sunday, we're going to have Tim Ruffin lead class for us. And then next Wednesday night, we are going to jump right into Colossians. So I'd encourage you in your lesson books to be looking ahead. Colossians starts on, there's kind of two books in the lesson book, but you'll find Colossians after Ephesians. But go ahead and be reading the book of Colossians because we're going to start right into that. I'd like to review just for a few moments here what we talked about Sunday morning. I thought we had really good discussion Sunday morning. You guys added really good feedback and really good discussion. And what I thought may be a more succinct discussion, I think we just kind of scratched the surface as far as children and parents and what's all there. So just by way of review, we're in Ephesians chapter 6. And what did we talk about Sunday morning in regards to children? And then the follow-up question is, what did we talk about with respect to fathers? Okay. Children are to obey their parents, and then fathers, they're not to provoke their children to wrath. Instead, what are fathers to do? Nurture them, teach them, to bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And really that last phrase there, in the Lord, we talked about how even with children in verse 1, obey your parents in the Lord. So the principle that Paul is teaching here, it's within the relationship of the child and the parent, the father and the children, but it really goes back to serving God. And we've seen that principle with wives and husbands and really all throughout chapter 5 and 6 as we talk about relationships. And we're going to continue to see that here as we get into bondservants and masters. The other thing that we discussed Sunday morning that I think is a really strong principle is that, this command to children and to honor your father and mother, there's really no age limit or timer on that. That's a lifelong principle. And I think there was some good discussion about that. Honoring your parents, we're commanded to do that our whole life. Children, obviously there's children who are little, but Paul was writing this letter to Christians at the church in Ephesus, and they had parents, and they were new Christians in the Lord. And so there's principles here that just carry out throughout our entire lives. So I think that's important to recognize. Anything else in verses 1 through 4 anyone wanted to add that we didn't talk about? Or Tim, anything you want to bring up before we move into verse 5? Okay. All right. So let's look now at verses 5 through 9. And let me just frame out tonight We're not going to have a ton of time to get into all the individual pieces of the armor. Some people preach whole lesson series on each individual piece of the armor. We just don't have that kind of time. So tonight will be second half of class as we get into the second part of chapter 6. It'll be a little more high level. Not that we won't look at the individual pieces, but we're just not going to have time to delve into as much detail as I think we'd all like to. But before we do that, let's look at verse 5 through 9. It says, "Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free." So, just real basic question here. What's a bondservant? Slave, yeah. And don't let that word slave trigger, late 1800s. This is not the type of slavery we're talking about here. Slavery was a very common practice at this time in history and probably for most of history. I am not a historian, but slavery here is simply someone working for somebody and basically in possession of somebody else. So a master would own a slave technically as property, and that slave was subject to the master. So slavery exists today in other parts of the country. We, in the United States, we don't kind of come across this type of relationship between a master and a slave, but one relationship that we all are probably a part of, or most of us, is employer-employee relationships. And so I don't think it's too kind of out of bounds to discuss what Paul says here in that context. This idea of us being employees working for an employer, or as we'll see in verse 9, an employer with employees. So that's how I'd like to discuss this section. Obviously, he's very direct as far as servants or slaves, bond servants and masters, but I think we could take application for us today. So that's what I'd like to, that's the setting I'd like to look at this in. So what are some things that jump out to you in verse 5 that he applies to, or that he commands bondservants or slaves? Or in this case, if we can think about it in the setting of an employee, what are some things that he mentions here? Okay, obey. That's very simple, but it's very direct. And that really kind of ties back to verse 1. That's the command to children, and we kind of see a parallel here. And obey your earthly masters. In what way are you to do that? Okay, as you would Christ. And we'll come back to that. That's good. What does he say before that? With fear and trembling. So if you look up these words, it's literally with fear and trembling. And what would you infer from that? What's kind of the point Paul's making here to slaves who are serving their masters? Absolutely. A high level of respect. Those slaves better take their master very seriously. You better serve him with fear and trembling. If he tells you to do something, you better do it. It's as simple as that and as hard as that. So there's real emotion tied to the service of a slave, and sometimes that's going to go against maybe what they want to do. And then also he says, with a sincere heart. What's kind of captured in that terminology? What does that entail? Integrity? What else?
Well, just the idea of single-mindedness.
Okay, yeah, that's the word just looking it up. It literally means single-mindedness, and what does that mean?
Well, that's you're doing it for the right reason.
Yeah.
And you don't have an ulterior motive
Yeah.
associated with it.
So, slaves, you're to serve your masters with a sincere heart. You're to be focused on what your task is. Obviously, for slaves, that covers a litany of different things. But they were to do that with fear, with trembling, with single-mindedness. And then I think maybe more subtle, but verse 6, he says, not by the way of eye service. What does that mean? Yeah, only when people are looking. That's probably easier to think of in terms of a younger child in his teenage years, getting his first job or something like that. But that principle never ends. In fact, that carries all the way through, for those of us who are working, our careers. The principle here is that we're not just doing a good job when the boss walks by. We're doing a good job all the time, regardless if he's watching or not. And then the next aspect of that kind of relates to the same thing. Not by the way of eye service as people pleasers. What's the idea there? I think some of it's tied to this idea of eye service, but how would you? Okay, good. Yeah, doing enough to get by, maybe just doing the bare minimum, maybe only doing the things that maybe your boss sees on the surface. There could be a lot of different aspects there. But to me, the terms that Paul uses here are interesting, and I think we can relate to these things, especially in our workplaces. But, yeah.
Something else as we're reading this, we need to see that doesn't say anything about the master other than he's the master.
Okay.
It's not if he's a nice guy or it's good or bad or anything else. You serve him like you're serving the Lord.
Yeah, and the word, so Tim's pointing out the fact that there's not much mentioned about the master, good guy, bad guy, whatever. In fact, the word master here is Lord. So it's someone who's in authority. Take that principle, apply it to today in our work situations. What is it as an employee, what is it so easy to do sometimes with our employer in that context? Complain, talk behind their back, do a bad job when they're not looking, cut corners. There's all kinds of things that can lead to. But he says at the end of verse 6, you're to do all these things. You're to serve as a bondservant as what? And this was mentioned earlier. Who are you really serving? Yeah, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. And this kind of gets back to what he's been saying all along. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. Fathers, bring your children up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And I said this on Sunday, but it's almost to me as if the way these relationships work is that they are somewhat of a conduit with our relationship with God. The way that we serve our parents, the way that we raise our kids, the way that we serve our employers, we're serving God. And so he's placing a lot of emphasis on you're not just serving your master, you're serving God in all these things that you do. And then he says, verse 7, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man. Anything in that verse that jumps out at you, that you see? Yes. Yes, absolutely. We're serving God, we're serving Christ, and if that's the primary relationship that we have, then in many ways this will take care of itself. In the way that we go about day to day, the way we serve our master or serve our employer, we're serving Christ, we're working for Christ. In verse 8, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. So that verse to me is really interesting. The first part of it, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive back from the Lord. What's the implication there? Think about the master. Whether the master is, as was mentioned earlier, whether he's good or bad, treats you fairly, unfairly, your service supersedes that. It's about what you'll receive back from God. And then to me, the last part is probably the most interesting, whether he is a bondservant or is free. In some way, this part of the whole discussion, it kind of doesn't throw out the bondservant relationship, but it almost just says, look, this is a level playing field. Whether you're a bondservant or free, this is the way you're to live your life. This is the way you're to interact. I think especially as employees to your employer, you're to serve in this kind of way. You're serving as to the Lord. And it doesn't matter if you're a bondservant or if you're free. So what are some applications to kind of bring this to more present day application? What are some applications as an employee that we could draw from this section? What are some practical things that we could apply to our everyday, our work, our careers, whatever it may be?
Doug, I've got a couple of thoughts.
Okay, good.
As you've been talking through all of these elements, and perhaps somebody a little bit more knowledgeable of the historical aspect can speak to this, but certain slaves or bondservants in this era may not have been sold, but may have sold themselves into slavery because they could not take care of themselves.
Yes.
So because of that specific instances, they would have more, or they should have more of an obligation to their masters to serve them in the right way because they're doing them a solid. Just like we, in our times today, we can't just up and start a business when we're 18, 19, 20 years old unless you have a lot of additional capital to do so.
Sure.
A lot of us have to go out and say, I need a job, can you help me out? And because of that, we owe a lot to our employers.
Okay. That's a really good point. So Jay Clark's, and I'm glad you brought that up. So a lot of slaves were volunteer slaves. I don't know if that's the right way to say that, but what's that? Okay, thank you. Indentured servants. They chose slavery. And in fact, if you go back to our history, that's how a lot of slaves were too, but that's a separate point. But because of that, how much more do these principles apply? And I think that's a really good point. And then maybe bringing that forward to present day, just thinking about someone who's young and starting off. Usually it's more the case that you're having to sign up. You don't have your own, you're not the master kind of right out of the gate. You're working for somebody else. And did you have a second point?
Yeah, if you are one of those free men, if you are one of those people who are able to go out and create something of your own, you're thankful of the knowledge that you've been given to be able to start your own. If you work hard, you work for the Lord, saying, I've been blessed with this knowledge to be able to do well for myself. And then you turn around and you do that to people who come and
Yeah.
work for you.
Yeah.
But you'll get into that obviously in the back.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I appreciate you bringing that out. And I failed to mention that about bondservants. Some were probably just born into it. But from my understanding, what I've read, and I'm no expert, some kind of, they were indentured to their master, and they needed a master because they had nothing. They were broke. They needed someone to take care of them. What are some other, before we talk about the master / employer, what are some other practical applications that we can draw from this text for us today? Yes.
I was talking to a young man last week. He had a conversation with a young woman who was working at a location where there were 6 or 8 people working as a group, and she was new, and the only people that would recognize her and befriend her was other new people. And the people that had been there longer just kind of sat back and neglecting to really put a lot of effort into their work and so forth and so on.
Okay. Yes, absolutely.
Lord knows whether we're being kind and trying to help and encourage those who are struggling with difficulties and so forth and so forth. And
Yeah,
we need to keep that in mind. You know, the Lord sees everything we do.
yeah, that's a really good point.
If we're living like we should, that's a good thing.
So when thinking about this, you can kind of picture in your mind maybe in a old English factory where there's all these sewing tables and everyone's working, and when the master, when whoever's the manager walks by, someone stops working as much. For me, as I thought about this, the world we work in today is so different. I'm not saying jobs like that still don't exist, but think about, and maybe more for the younger generation here, think about working in a virtual environment where you're working from home. You're only seeing people you work with when you're logged in, through a virtual meeting like Zoom or something like that. This stuff right here, it applies to that situation too. And I work from home, and I find it hard sometimes to really be fully engaged as an employee all the time, doing everything that my master, my employer wants me to be doing. So times have changed. That's just one kind of simple example, but I would say the virtual environment that a lot of us are working in, it presents some different challenges that maybe generations ago, some of you all in this room didn't have to face. Dan.
I think it's interesting that in each of these relationships, Paul starts with the person in the weaker position.
Okay, good.
Sometimes in this specific example, we kind of fall into that trap of like, well, if only my situation was better. If only I had a better boss, I'd be X, Y, Z. If only I had this opportunity. But, Paul's instructions kind of starts with those that didn't have an opportunity to choose. And there's still responsibility in how we react to that. And I think that goes a long way in how we live our lives.
Really great point. I hadn't kind of put all that together, but yeah, he definitely, with all these relationships, he starts with the weaker vessel of the two, and then he builds on that. But no, really good points. Trey.
Yeah, it says, whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord. And it's interesting to think from an employee standpoint, certainly in this where we are and all that kind of stuff. Probably a lot of us at given times have equated all of these things to we'll end up being blessed with promotions or more money or a better job or whatever. We do all these things, right? And I tend to believe in a lot of cases actually fulfilling this. Like I know I've talked to Dylan about this. Like if you will operate this way, if you're
Yeah.
mowing somebody's grass, you're probably gonna get more and more work. You're gonna do things the right way, etc. You're gonna be dependable. All these things, these godly principles. But in the slave and master relationship, that what's not being said is God will set you free on earth.
Yeah.
And, after 2 years of the service, you'll no longer be a slave. You'll then be free physically. And he's saying you'll receive it back from the Lord.
Yeah.
So you're going to get the best repayment back for you operating this way. And, I've had to remind myself of that many times. Like sometimes the reward is not in this immediate, well, I did it all the right way, so now I'm going to get this great new gig. Or I'm going to get this, awesome new season of rest after all this hard work that I've put in.
Sure.
That's not really necessarily what's guaranteed. It's something much better. But I don't know.
Yeah.
I tend to, and I guess maybe I've talked to a lot of people who look at that. They're looking for that physical return. I know God will bless me with this thing probably in the next year, or whatever. And when you think about it from the master-slave situation, you're like, probably a lot of those slaves were always slaves.
Yeah, and
Kept having to be looking at things this way.
and people probably think that way all the way into retirement.
Sure.
Because it just, they keep chasing it for the wrong reasons. As you were saying that, it made me think back to honor your father and mother, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. It doesn't say you're going to be rich and have everything you need, but it's the fact that if you listen to your parents and the wisdom they provide you, God's going to be with you, which is the most important thing. So, a lot more. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Great employees are employees that want success for their employer, not because they want to get promoted, but because they want their employer to truly be successful.
Okay.
And
Sure. Well, and that, what you're talking about, Steve, and by the way, if you want a job, you can come work for me whenever you want. But that principle, it really is, we see that with all these relationships. Honor your father and mother, whether they deserve it or not. Wives, submit to your husbands, whether they're in the Lord or not. You're setting an example to them. You're setting an example to your employer by the way that you conduct yourself.
But in every one of these instances, the second set of instructions was to the one in charge, which was basically, if you do what you're supposed to do, then the ones that are subject to you will be there.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
if husbands treat their wives correctly, they don't have any trouble being in subjection. If employers treat their employees well, the employees are going to be loyal.
absolutely.
You know, we don't want to ignore the flip side.
Sure.
Because even back to Steve's example, we're in it for the glory of God. But God wants us to be successful in our efforts to please Him. So it's a two-way street.
Absolutely. And to that point, let's go right into verse 9. Masters, do the same to them, to your point, Don, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there's no partiality with him. So I mentioned earlier, master here is Lord, which denotes, I would say, more authority. But it's this idea of someone who is obviously over the slave or the bondservant. Do the same to them and stop your threatening. Well, why might he be saying that? What might the master be doing?
Just like the fathers don't provoke your children.
That's great.
They were provoking, and evidently the masters were threatening.
That's great. That's a really good parallel there. I didn't think about that, Tim.
Well, and when you go back to that time and read about slaves, they were an asset
The property.
in the society's eyes. And the owner could do anything he wanted with it, anything. There was no protection, no law. And it would be easy to say, well, you need to do this, and it's all for me. And if you don't do it, I'm going to punish you. I'm going to whip you, or I'm going to beat your children, or whatever.
Sure.
And you have no recourse. But yet, we're told to do that, and the master is say, you've got to look at them like I look at them, and honor them in that role that they're playing on your behalf.
Really good points. I'm doing a bad job of time management, but John, yes.
My granddaughter-in-law is going in the hospital this evening to get me a new great-grandson.
Oh, congratulations.
And it's an exciting day for me. And we go out, we take the kids out, buy them lunch and so forth and so on. We was out one day to a lunch, and I'm praying, and my other granddaughter is going to deliver us a girl in July. And I'm asking for her health and the baby and all this and that. Of course, my son, who's a cancer patient, for the Lord to keep him in remission, so forth and so on. And I said to her, oh, Liz, when I got done, I said, I forgot to bless you and the baby. And I said, I pray for you all the time. And instantly she said, God knows. And that's what it boils down to. God knows.
Yeah. Well, and that's exactly what he says. Is a great point. Knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven. Note where the position in heaven, and that there's no partiality with him. So, really good point. God knows everything, and when we're serving our masters, or whether we're over our employees, the way that we do that, it's unto the Lord. A lot more we could say about this section. I want to move on to to the last part of this chapter, and with the remaining time, just maybe give some highlights on this whole armor of God. Did you have something, Tim?
Yeah, I think it is verse 10 caps it, I think. And
Okay.
Are you going to?
I was just going to read it first, and then we can. No, it's okay, and then we can dive into it. So let's just read briefly, beginning verse 10. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of His might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over the present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. Stand therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and as shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. In all circumstances, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, praying at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. And I'll just stop right there. So yes.
Verse 10 is the capstone of everything he's talking about. He says, finally be strong in the Lord and the strength of his might. That be strong is a passive, it's a command, but it's passive. And what it means is that the Lord will give you the strength because you're doing it for the right reason. You're not looking for the outcome from the master.
Okay.
In one sense, the slave, the master's not looking for he's doing this to serve the Lord, knowing the good will come from the Lord, whether it's good in this life or not. And that's where strength is found. That's the ability to do it in spite of the circumstance or the situation. It's the Lord's strength.
So to Tim's point about where our strength comes from, just you can listen. Chapter 1, verse 19. And what is the immeasurable greatness of his power towards us who believe, according to the working of his great might, that he worked in Christ when he raised him from the dead and seated him at the right hand in the heavenly places. And then chapter 3, verse 16, that according to the riches of his glory, he may grant you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in your inner being. And I mentioned this when I went through the end of chapter 3. Where does that strength that we get from God, what did that strength accomplish? I just read it in chapter 1. What did that strength of God that gives us strength, what did God do with that? Look back at chapter 1. What did he do with that strength? What did he do with that might? Look at verse 20 of chapter 1. He raised Jesus from the dead. He overcame death. He overcame sin. He overcame the devil, who we're about to talk about. Be strong in the Lord. That's the strength we're talking about. Don't have any misconceptions about what that strength can accomplish. If you understand that, why would you not put your strength in the Lord? Be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. There's a lot packed in that verse. But as we've read, the armor he's not saying just, put on what fits. Put on your strengths. Don't worry about your weaknesses. Put it all on. Put on the whole armor of God. And then he says that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. So on a very basic level, what can we learn about the devil from that passage, from what we see right there? He is active. How does he operate? Schemes. What other words would you associate with scheming? Huh? Trickery, manipulation, good.
Deception.
Huh? Cunning, a really good one. Deception. Cunning arts, deceit, craft, trickery. Evil. Devil, it means diabolos, false accuser, slanderer. If there's nothing y'all take away from this class tonight, this is what I want y'all to take away. We are under attack today, right now, by the devil. Not just our kids, because they are certainly under attack growing up in the age that they're living in, but everyone in this room, we are under attack. The church is under attack. Christianity is under attack. This is real. This is a battle that we are still fighting today. There's nothing else you take away from this class. I want you to take that away. And my point in saying that is we can't sit on the sideline. Just coming here when we come here, that's good. We need to be here. We need to attend, but our Christianity is so much more than that. We can't be sideline Christians. The devil is actively plotting and scheming against us, and he uses many different ways to do that. We can look at the garden. We can look at how Jesus overcame that in the desert or in the wilderness. But we're under attack, folks. This is no, well, Paul said that back then, and, he was talking about in verse 13, there would be this evil day that comes. No, he's saying you need to be ready. I don't think he's saying in verse 13 that there's going to be this climactic evil day that we need to be prepared for. Maybe that is the case, but I think more generally he's saying you need to be ready. You need to stand firm and be ready because of who the devil is and how he operates. Now, verse 12 and 13, I'd love your insight because there's a lot packed in here, but what do you yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Verse 13, he almost word for word repeats himself in verse 11.
Yeah.
Saying, "Upon the whole armor
Yep.
of God, you got to put on to be able to withstand." And the implication is, if you don't put on the whole armor of God, you can do it without this, you stand no chance.
Yeah, and great point made by Steve. Verse 13 is a bookend with verse 11. And when there's a bookend or a sandwich, what's in the middle? Well, look at verse 12. We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. What is that all about? Where have we seen a reference to spiritual forces in the heavenly places? Where have we seen that already? Chapter 3. So that through the church the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. You wanting to say something?
It's also in chapter 1 about where Christ is seated above all other authorities.
So that first part, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure I can explain what all that means. But the second part to me, but against the cosmic powers over the present darkness, spiritual forces, there's things at work that we can't see that are fighting against us. And to me, one of the takeaways for me is that the devil has his influence in those places. And he's fighting hard to pull us away from God. But there's a battle. And we have to be ready. And we have to, as he says here, we have to take up the whole armor of God. And then, as I mentioned earlier, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. Yes.
In most practical sense, Christianity is not physical armor and physical fighting
Yep.
against flesh and blood. So it could also have a reference to that the Christian soldier prepares himself spiritually, mentally, doesn't actually get a sword and a helmet and go out and fight against another nation or another religion.
Sure.
In order to advance.
Good point, and that makes a ton of sense to me, and that's probably what he's getting at there.
2 Corinthians 10, a couple verses, starting verse 3. For though we walk in the flesh, we're not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every thought and opinion raised against the knowledge of God. Take every thought captive to obey Christ.
Okay, good. So, real briefly, let's just talk about the pieces of the armor. He starts off with the belt of truth. To me, it's no coincidence he starts with truth. There has to be an absolute, there has to be a right and wrong. If there's not, everything's relative. It all falls apart. We could preach a lesson about that, especially in the world we're living in our country. Everything's relative. But he starts with the belt of truth. A belt, obviously, with armor, holds everything together. The breastplate of righteousness. Chapter 4, verse 24. or verse 23, to be renewed in the spirit of your minds and to put on the new self, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. And then he says, as shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. This one's kind of an interesting one to me, probably not one I think of as much, but what is the peace? What is our peace as Christians? That's, I guess, my main question with this. What is our peace? And he talks about it in chapter 2.
It's that we're in the right relationship with God.
It's our relationship with God, and we can be in a right relationship with him because of what?
We've been divided Christ dwell within us.
Yeah. Because of what Christ has done for us. Because Christ died and was buried and resurrected, we can have, Christ is our peace. We can have peace with God. Yeah.
When you go back to that wrestling against flesh and blood, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. We are trying to bring them to the Lord. They're following Satan. We're fighting against Satan with what we're doing here. That is that the feet are what take us to where we need to be and what we need to do in that sense. And we're prepared with the gospel to share it.
Yeah. And if you don't, in some ways, if you don't have your shoes on, you can't go anywhere. So we have to understand why we are saved, why we're redeemed, why we have peace, why we have something that the world doesn't have. It's because of what Jesus did for us. When we have that, then we can go out into the world. We can put on our shoes of readiness. And then he talks about the shield of faith. One thing, I'll just say one thing about this. The shield of faith, as you see there, it can extinguish all the flaming darts. Not just one, not just a few. It can extinguish them all. The shield is obviously defensive, but the point is our faith, no matter what the devil schemes or throws at us, if we're rooted and grounded in our faith with God, we can withstand it. Then he talks about the helmet of salvation. Helmet, protects a soldier from a fatal blow to the head. And I would say being assured of our salvation, knowing what our salvation is and why we have it, that's going to help us fight against the devil. The sword of the Spirit, which is interesting to me. The sword, probably when we think of armor, that may be the first thing that comes to our mind. The sword actually comes last. But the sword of the Spirit, the Word of God, we didn't have time, but I wanted to go to Jesus in the wilderness and how he combated Satan. But then finally here he says, praying at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. And I would say some of the rest of the chapter is about prayer. But why do you think he ends this whole section talking about the armor of God with prayer? Why might he conclude it that way?
Because it causes us to talk with God about what we need to be doing this. We need his strength. We need him to fill us with the fullness of Christ. We need to have Christ showing the path for us.
Okay, good.
And Doug, I kind of see it as it's Christ doing the fight for us.
Yes.
I see this imagery, same thing that you
Yeah.
kind of see in Revelation with Christ on the white horse. We are worshiping him while he's doing the heavy lifting. He's doing
Yeah.
the fighting. We're here to have faith and the word of God to live by and to worship daily and go into prayer with him and say thank you for all of everything that you've done for us.
Great point. We'll end there. I appreciate everything. And once again, Sunday morning, Tim will be leading our class, and then Wednesday night, we'll get into Colossians. Thank you.